Hi everyone! So last year around March or April I put out a video called Bright Eyeshadow Palettes, My Recommendations. And that video did really well and I was so pleased because I was really just talking about products that I already use and love, but I know sometimes people don't really know what to pick up when they're looking for bright eyeshadow palettes. So people have been asking for a follow-up to that, which is what this video is going to be. Of course, all the palettes that I mentioned in last year's video still hold true. I still love them dearly, but I don't know if they're still all available right now. The palettes I'm going to be mentioning in this video are currently available, so you can get your hands on them if you want them. But consider this video like an extension of last year's video because I still use those palettes all the time. I just want to mention even more that you can get your hands on if you're looking for more bright eyeshadow palettes. The first palette that I'm going to talk about is one I'm surprised I didn't actually mention in the original video, and that is the Violet Voss Hashtag palette. I've talked about this palette a lot, so it's probably no surprise that this is in this video. But this is a fully colorful palette that makes the absolute perfect sunset eye look. I reviewed this probably about a year ago and I was over the moon with it. I just loved every single color combination that I put together with this palette. And for any palette that I mentioned in this video, if I do have a review for it, I will link to it down below. So check out the description box in case you're looking for more information specifically about a particular palette that I mentioned in this video. But anyway, this one was just so much fun to work with. And I think when I initially got it, I was worried that too many of the colors were going to be too similar on the eyes. Like there's a row of sort of yellow golds here, a row of oranges, and a row of like purples. And I had thought that some of these colors would be too similar per row. In particular, like the gold with a slightly more orange gold here, and some of these like pinky orange shades. I thought they were going to be very similar on the eyes, and in the end they were not. And they just really helped to sort of develop an eye look. When I was younger, I used to think that I could just pop two colors on my eyes and it would make the perfect eye look. When in reality, you really have to use multiple colors in order to create a beautiful gradient. And I feel like this really provides that for you. The shades are mostly shimmer, but there are a ton of mattes in here too, which really help to round out the palette. And in fact, the whole top row is matte shadows, so that's really helpful when you're trying to create a look. The pigmentation on all of these shadows is super saturated. The colors themselves are easy to work with, and I really enjoy this palette, and I go back to it pretty frequently. So yeah, this is a huge recommendation for bright eyeshadow palettes. And I also like the fact that the outer embossed font actually matches the inside. I think that's a cute touch. And the next palette I need to talk about is Juvia's Place Masquerade palette. And I've been going back to this one quite a bit lately. It is, actually, it's colorful and it's neutral. So the top two rows are very vibrant, colorful shadows. And the ones on the bottom are very warm toned neutral. I mean, they do focus more on like the orange bronze side of things, but these two are infinitely more neutral than the top two rows. And funnily enough, when I first started working with this palette, I really only stuck to the top two rows, and you can create absolutely beautiful looks with those. I really like that they're all pretty much cool tone. I mean, there's some here that are a little bit more warm. And I've actually been surprised that I've been able to use the top two rows by itself. There isn't really a ton of deeper matte shades in the top two rows, aside from this one here called Zobo. The purples and blues are very shimmery, so I hadn't thought that they would work in the outer corner of my eye. But they actually do, and I think I can just credit that to the fact that the shadows are actually quite deep in nature, so it doesn't look too shimmery if you're putting that on the outer corner of your eye. Now, more recently, I've started to actually incorporate some of the neutrals alongside the more cool-toned, colorful shadows at the top, and I've really been liking that look. Mixing neutrals with color is not something I ever really do because I feel like you should just wear neutrals or just wear colorful shadows if you're going to be putting it on your eye. I don't really know why I feel like that, and in fact I've looked at some people putting a colorful shadow on the lid with a brown on the outer corner, and it's actually turned out quite well. Also, totally worth mentioning, this is drugstore price basically, and they always have sales going on their website. I think this palette might be 20 or 25 bucks at Ulta, which they're now sold out, which is very nice. Juvia's Place is super inexpensive, and oftentimes the quality is much better than the regular drugstore brands. And I say regular brands because, you know, like CoverGirl, Maybelline, they've all been at the drugstore for ages. And while I don't really think of Juvia's Place as a drugstore item because I can't buy it at like Shoppers Drug Mart here, the prices are equivalent to drugstore. So highly recommend this, especially if you're looking for like just a more inexpensive palette because you want to try out color. And in speaking of drugstore eyeshadow palettes, I have to point out that it's actually quite difficult to go to the drugstore and find colorful eyeshadow palettes with a formula that is actually good. I feel like that is a huge pain point at the drugstore because they really only create neutral eyeshadow palettes, and when they start to delve into color, I feel like the quality can be really just not good. But thankfully I have been trying out an eyeshadow palette from the drugstore that is Brights that I have really been enjoying, and that one is by NYX. This is their Ultimate Shadow Palette, and appropriately it's called Brights. I had initially thought that this whole palette was straight matte colors, but some of them do have a little bit of shimmer in here, but I would never think of them as a shimmery formula. Some of them just have a little bit of specks of glitter that sort of dust away when you apply it. The red has a little bit of that shimmer in it, and the green up here does as well. So what I like about this palette in particular is that they've provided you a rainbow palette, which I really like, but they've not just given you one single color throughout that rainbow. They've actually given you about 2 or 3 depending on which shade we're talking about. So there's a red and a pink, which pink is red basically, it's just a lighter version of it. And then you've got 2 oranges, 2 purples, 2 sort of pinky purples here, 2 blues, 2 teals, 2 greens, and 2 yellows. And I really like that. I like that they've given you 2 shades of each color, roughly, so that you can make a look that's a little bit more diverse. I feel more often than not, a brand will throw a green in a palette or a blue. That's the biggest culprit lately, is throwing one single blue in a palette full of neutrals and calling it a day. And I find it's actually really difficult to use a color when it's thrown haphazardly into a palette, just because you've got really nothing to blend it out aside from neutrals. And if you're using color on your eye, it's much more preferential to actually blend it out with a similar shade, just of a lighter tone. So that's why this palette works really well for me. If I want to wear the green on the outer corner of my eye, I can use the paler green to sort of buff it up towards my crease. Same thing with the blues, same thing with the purples, and I did use the red on the outer corner of my eye and buffed it out with the pink. It's a beautiful look, and it just helps create a gorgeous transition. Whereas again, with most palettes, if they throw in a token color, what the heck do you blend it out with aside from like a brown or a black? And really you can't blend a color out with a black, you can only deepen it. So I really like how NYX has put this palette together because it makes a lot of sense. Now this is not one that you would necessarily use by itself. I feel like this works really well if I want to throw shimmery colors onto my lid and then use the shades in here to buff them out, just because this is predominantly matte. So the palette that I've been using a ton with the NYX one is the Violet Voss Rainbow Palette. And this one is straight up shimmer. There are no matte shades in here whatsoever. So while this is a beautiful palette to use, it's not really one you're gonna wanna use by itself. And I don't say that to discourage you from getting it, because I think it's a fantastic palette and not all of us need just a standalone palette in their collection. So I would highly recommend this if you're looking for colorful shadows you just want to throw on the lid. All of the shadows in here are super shimmery. They're quite buttery to apply. I do sometimes wet my brush if I want to create a little bit more sheen in the product, but they work just fine dry, so that's not an issue as well. The shades up here, Indigo and Violet, look very, very similar in the pan, but they actually do apply to the lid quite differently, which is super appreciated because I don't like buying a palette when you've got 2 of the same shade, essentially. One that surprised the crap out of me is this shade up here called Pearl. It looks like a white, and I was like, oh, why have they thrown a straight white into this palette? It just seems kind of silly. It's actually a really pale white gold shadow that looks luminescent on the lid. Pearl is hands down one of the best colors in this palette, which feels funny to say because it's clearly the least colorful looking in this palette. But again, I've used all of these on my lid and used the NYX palette to sort of buff them out, and I've been so happy with this. I put off buying this for a really long time just because I thought I wouldn't use it. I didn't like that there weren't any mattes in it. But now that I've bought it and started using it for several months, I am so happy with it and would highly recommend it to everybody out there. I even like the black, which I wasn't expecting either. It's called Eclipse, and it's kind of, well, I guess this would be the most matte shadow in this palette, but it does have silver glitter in it, so that does show up on the eyes. I use that to deepen up some of the colors if I want to sort of just bring some dimension to the outer corner. I haven't used it a ton, but it does work in that respect. So yeah, super impressed with the Violet Voss Rainbow palette, and it works really well with the NYX Ultimate Shadow palette just because this is really matte and this is really shimmery. The next palette is another rainbow palette, which I have to admit it, I love rainbow palettes. And it's one that I discovered just before summer last year, and that sticks out in my head because I wore it for Pride and I really enjoyed it. So this is the Riot Extreme Eyeshadow Palette by Tease Cosmetics. Now Tease can be quite difficult to find. I don't even know if you can purchase it in the US, but in Canada you can get it at the Bay. If you're over in Europe, I think Tease Cosmetics is more readily accessible over there. The palette does say it's made in Italy, but I don't actually think it's an Italian brand. Anyway, the inside of the palette is absolutely beautiful. And the shadows over on this side, the full rainbow spectrum, are actually all mattes, and the colors over here are quite shimmery. The two shimmery colors are kind of like a silvery white, and the one up here is quite a deep purple. I didn't tend to use those very much. I mostly stuck to the matte shadows on this side. Now, what generally tends to concern me about bright, matte, vibrant eyeshadow colors is that they can be a little bit chalky at times, and I think it's because there's a lot of white in the base to make them brighter. I didn't really have that problem with this palette, which surprised me because the texture does feel a little bit more dry on these shadows. That's just something to point out. It didn't really bother me, except when I tried to blend the yellow out a little bit with the orange. I felt like that was slightly chalky. But other than that, the rest of the colors are absolutely beautiful together, and I was pleasantly surprised with how well they blended together because I opted to make a rainbow eyeshadow look almost every single time that I use this palette. And sometimes if they're too matte or too dry, the colors just won't go together very well. It's like you try to blend back and forth and they just kind of like either lift up or they sort of lay on top of each other, but it always looks like it's just gonna sort of flake off. Didn't really have that problem with these, so I was really happy about that. So I need to play a little bit more with the shimmery side of the palette, but honestly, I was so drawn towards the vibrant matte rainbow. I mean, just looking at that on the viewfinder makes me happy. This is such a pleasing palette, and I really like how compact this is. Like, it's a super tiny palette. I don't love plastic on my palettes. I do prefer cardboard, but it's so compact, it's travel friendly. You've got a huge mirror here too. This was such a nice one to discover. I think I initially saw this palette on Instagram and I was like, I need it immediately, and I hunted it down, and I'm so happy that I picked it up. And the very last palette that I have to talk about is one that I just reviewed on my channel 2 days ago, so I won't talk too in-depth about it. Definitely go see that video if you're interested, but it's the Colorpop Chasing Rainbows palette. Currently wearing it on my eyes today. I am so pleased with this thing. It just came out for Colourpop's Holiday 2018 collection. It is limited edition, so I don't know how long it's gonna be around, but it is still currently available, so get it while you can. Now, I call this a rainbow palette, as do they, but somebody pointed out to me that it's actually missing a green. And I don't know how I missed that initially. So I picked this up over the holiday season, and I've really been impressed with it. There is such a good mix of mattes and shimmers, and in fact there's actually way more mattes than there are shimmers, which I personally like. But the mattes are also in colors that are quite deep, which is another thing I really enjoy. I really like when there's colorful matte shadows that are quite deep, namely purple and a blue or a teal. That is really helpful for me when I'm creating an eye look if I've got those sort of tones in a matte color, because I tend to put that kind of color on my outer corner, and this palette covers those bases for me. This teal and this purple are matte and beautiful to work with. And there's even a black down here too, so if you want to darken any of the other colors up, definitely add the black. I've really been enjoying using all of the colors in here, and honestly, there's no duds. I don't love the browns. I think they're a weird addition to the palette because everything else is so colorful in here. But I have used them a little bit to sort of buff out the outer corner or throw something in the crease, and they do work that way, but honestly I tend to stick more towards the colorful shadows in this palette. So I was really happy to have picked this up over the holiday season, not only because I'm enjoying the formula and the fact that it's so inexpensive, but also because I've really disregarded Colourpop for quite a while because I didn't love their Super Shock shadows and I don't like their ultra matte liquid lipsticks. So I honestly just started avoiding the brand. But this has really made me realize that I think they've got more to offer me now. and I'm really happy that I picked up the Chasing Rainbows palette. So that's it for round 2 of bright, colorful eyeshadow palettes that I've been enjoying. Again, this is a continuation of last year's video, so if you missed out on that, I'll link to it down below in case you want to check out my recommendations in that video. These just happen to be the products that I've been enjoying since that one got published. If you have any currently available bright eyeshadow palette recommendations, please leave them down below, and I'll see you next time. Bye!